ráðherra og samkomugestir í forðum gerð. Tilkoma þessa málþings kannski stuttumál svo að það var í mars á þessu ári, það var stjórnarfundur hjá EDF, European Disability Forum, þar sem ég komst að því að við getum sótt styrk til þess að halda ráðstefnu varðandi innleiðingu á samningi Sameinuðu þjóðanna rétt til fatlaðs fólks. Þetta var þegar komið í farveg til heima. Það var nefnd starfandi sem að sérstaklega fjalla slíku og friðurgreinina og ÖBI átti aðild þar af. En við vildum líka þrýsta til á stjórnvöld að nú ef ekki drífa þetta. Mjög mikilvægt og að fá þetta í gegn. Við sóttum þennan styrk. Ég hafði haft samband við bæði innanríkisráðherra og velferðarráðherra. Þeir tóku vel í þetta að vera með okkur í þessu og við sendum út umsögnina, fengum svar, jákvætt svar og ég vil þakka EDF sérstaklega fyrir þeirra hlut í þessu máli. Þetta var Upphaf, þá kom að þessu innleiðingsráðuneytið, velferðarráðuneytið, Mannréttindaskrifstofa Íslands og rannsóknarsetur í fatlaðarfræðum við Háskóla Íslands. Auk sambands íslenskra sveitarfélaga með komið líka að þessu í fundahaldum undirbúningi. Því miður þá var ekki hægt að bjóða upp á táknmálstúlkun þar sem samskiptamiðstöð heyrnarlausra og heyrnarskertra hefur ekki séð sér fært að manna Málþingið og Hörpu við það verulega. Hjördís Harðardóttir, varaformaður Öryrkjabandalagsins, hún ætlaði að vera hér ráðstefnustjóri en þar sem við höfum ekki táknmálstúlka þá var það ekki hægt. En við höfum fengið hér góðan mann, Helga Hjörvar. Það kemur vel á óttan þar sem Helgi Hjörvar var fyrsti formaður þeirra nefndar sem var innleiðing. Hann fór líka þátt í samningi þessa samnings. Hann fór út til hann fór út og var búinn að vera að vinna að samningnum í New York á sínum tíma áður en hann var síðan samþykktur í Sameinuðu þjóðunum við síðan undirritum Íslandi 30. mars 2007. Kæru vinir, það eru 5 ár síðan og það ekki búið að einlega. En mér finnst að koma tími til að við höfum áfram með þetta og ég ætla að gefa Helga Hjörvar orðið.
Já, þakka þér kærlega fyrir Guðmundur og takk fyrir að vera fenginn hingað í dag og að tilefni til þess sé nú heldur leiðinlegt og málefni sem að sérstök ástæður til þess að fara rækilega í gegnum. En við höfum fylgst með býsna miklum breytingum í Stjórnarráði Íslands á undanförnum árum. Meðal annars hefur þar orðið til innanríkisráðuneyti sem að fer með í Stjórnarráðinu mannréttindamálin og kemur þar að leiðandi mjög sterklega að innleiðingu Mannréttindasáttmála Sameinuðu þjóðanna réttindi fatlaðs fólks. Hér fyrstur á mælendaskránni sá ráðherra sem að fer fyrir því ráðuneyti og er löngu þjóðkunnur fyrir baráttu sína fyrir mannréttindamálum og oft og einatt látið til sín taka mannréttindi fatlaðs fólks. Ég býð velkominn Ágúst Jónasson innanríkisráðherra.
Góðir málþingsgestir, sáttmáli Sameinuðu þjóðanna réttindi fatlaðs fólks var samþykktur á allsherjarþingi Sameinuðu þjóðanna 13. desember árið 2006 en tók gildi 3. maí árið 2008. Ísland var einn þeirra ríkja sem skrifaði undir sáttmálann þegar opnað var fyrir undirskriftir 30. mars 2007 og gerði það án fyrirvara við nokkur ákvæði hans. Með undirritun sinni tóku íslensk stjórnvöld fyrsta skrefið að fullgildingu sáttmálans sem fer fram í 2 þrepum, undirritun og fullgildingu. Með þessari aðferð gefst ríkjum ráðrúm til þess að undirbúa og aðlaga regluverk ríkisins að ákvæðum sáttmálans og tryggja að til þess bæjar einingar samfélagsins samþykki ráðstöfuninni. Með undirritun skuldbinda stjórnvöld sig til þess að brjóta ekki bága við ákvæði sáttmálans heldur vinna regluverk og framkvæmd í átt að ákvæðum hans og kröfum. Fyrst eftir að sú vinna hefur átt sér stað á heimavelli kemur að hætti fullgildingarinnar. Ég lýsi þessu til þess að leggja áherslu á mikilvægi þess að stjórnvöld taki skuldbindingar sínar á grundvelli alþjóðlegra samninga alvarlega. Raunverulega réttarbót á grundvelli slíkra samninga er að breytingar verði á landslögum, framkvæmd og viðhorfum heima fyrir. Það er verk sem tekur tíma og krefst sameiginlegs átaks fjölmargra aðila í samfélaginu. Svo er í hvert sinn sem Ísland undirgengst mannréttindaskuldbindingar á alþjóðlegum vettvangi. Í þessu ferli hafa aðskiljanlegir aðilar mismunandi hlutverk. Þó takmörk allra hlutaðeigandi sé eitt og hið sama er ekkert óeðlilegt við togstreitu þeirra í millum í ferlinu. Stjórnvöld eru ábyrgð á breytingum á lögum og regluverki. Þau eiga ekki að undirgangast neinar skuldbindingar nema hugur fylgi máli, nema orð og athöfn fylgist að, því mannréttindaskuldbindingar mega aldrei verða orðin tóm. Að þessu leyti mega stjórnvöld ekki fara fram úr sjálfum sér, heldur vera sjálfum sér samkvæmt þótt það tæki tíma. En stjórnvöldin mega þó ekki gerast værukær og þar koma hagsmuna og baráttusamtök eins og Öryrkjabandalagið til sögunnar. Þau gegna mikilvægu hlutverki. Ég vil nota þetta tækifæri til að þakka Öryrkjabandalagi Íslands og vil ég nefna formann bandalagsins Guðmund Magnússon sérstaklega fyrir gott samstarf sem einmittir fólkið í jákvæðu og uppbyggilegu aðhaldi og eftirrekstri. Það er mikilvægt að geta unnið saman að breytingum í samfélaginu eins og við erum tvímælalaust að gera á þessu sviði. Framkvæmdavaldið vill ekki fara hraðar en svo að ekki verði lofað upp í ermina. Öryrkjabandalaginu liggur hins vegar á því mannréttindi þoli enga bið. Biðin sé aldrei réttlætanleg. Í þessu tvennu er sú togstreita fólkin sem knýr okkur áfram. Framþróun verður ekki í þögnu og stöðnuðu umhverfi. Sú ríkisstjórn sem nú situr í landinu hefur hafið vegferðina að fullgildingu sáttmálans. Vinnan er byrjuð. Alþingi samþykkti síðastliðið vor tillögu velferðarráðherra að framkvæmda áætlun í málefnum fatlaðs fólks og á grundvelli hennar hefur innanríkisráðuneytinu formlega verið falið það vandasama verk að halda utan innleiðingarvinnu. Áfangasigrar hafa náðst og mikilvæg skref hafa þegar verið tekin. Árið 2010 skilaði nefnd undir forystu Helga Hjörvars alþingismanns og fundarstjóra okkar hér í dag skýrslu með tillögum að aðgerðum svo fullgilda mætti sáttmálann og hafa þær tillögur nýst vel. Dæmi úrbætur í formi lagabreytinga árið 2011 má nefna ný lög réttindagæslu fatlaðs fólks og viðurkenningu íslenska táknmálsins með lögum. Árið 2010 höfðu verið sett lög mannvirki og gefið út ný byggingarreglugerð sem taka mið af algildri hönnun með hliðsjón af ákvæðum sáttmálans aðgengi fatlaðs fólks. Aðgengi að opinberum vefjum hefur verið stórbætt og ráðist hefur verið í átaksverkefni sem ætlað er að bæta meðal annars aðgengi fatlaðra, rafræna þjónustu og lýðræðislega virkni á vefjum opinberra stofnana og sveitarfélaga. Í þessu skyni hefur ríkisstjórnin samþykkt ný aðgengisviðmið fyrir opinbera vefi til þess að bæta aðgengi að þeim, meðal annars fyrir blinda, sjónskerta og aðra sem þurfa að nota hjálpartæki við lestur, efnis og notkun vefja almennt, en að auki nú unnið að uppsetningu nýrrar vefþulu sem Blindrafélagið hefur þróað á vef innanríkisráðuneytisins. Í upphafi þingvetrar lagði ég svo fram frumvarp til breytinga á kosningalögum til þess að tryggja að framkvæmd kosninga í samræmi við 29. grein sáttmálans. Þar gert ráð fyrir að einstaklingur sem ekki getur hjálparlaust greitt atkvæði í kosningum ráði því sjálfur á hvern hátt honum veitt aðstoð. En þó að margt hafi áunnist á starfstíma ríkisstjórnarinnar bíður annað og það verður að segjast eins og að á ýmsum sviðum fer því fjarri að við standum okkur nógu vel. En góðir hlutir eru að gerast eins og ég þegar hef getið og á fundi sínum síðastliðinn þriðjudag samþykkti ríkisstjórnin að veita 10 milljónum króna til að klára þau verk sem út af standa svo að fullgilda megi sáttmálann. Skipuð verður samstarfsnefnd ráðuneyta að undirbúa fullgildingu sáttmálans og öll ráðuneyti munu yfirfara löggjöf á sínu málefnasviði og leggja til breytingar til samræmis við ákvæði sáttmálans. Öll ráðuneyti koma að vinnunni enda varða hagsmunir fatlaðs fólks alla þætti samfélagsins. Í þessari vinnu eru stór atriði sem þarf að skoða bæði lög og framkvæmd. Við viljum vanda okkur svo að réttar áhrif samningsins verði raunveruleg. Við viljum ekki segjast gera eitthvað sem síðar reynist innihaldslaust eða hefur ekki tilætluð áhrif. Skýrslur Evrópuráðsins og Sameinuðu þjóðunum Skýrslur frá Evrópuráðinu og Sameinuðu þjóðunum segja okkur að tiltekin ákvæði sáttmálans hafi reynst vandasöm í framkvæmd hjá aðildarríkjum. Við þurfum að læra af reynslu annarra og nýta okkur á jákvæðan hátt þau mistök sem kunna að hafa verið gerð annar staðar við innleiðinguna til þess að falla ekki í sömu gryfjur og aðrir hafa rapað í. Á þessu málþingi í dag fjöllum við 2 greinar sáttmála Sameinuðu þjóðanna réttindi fatlaðs fólks. Annars vegar þann hluta 4. greinarinnar þar sem fjallað hlutverk hagsmunahópa og hins vegar 33. grein þar sem fjallað samhæfingu stjórnsýslunnar og sjálfstæðan eftirlitsaðila. Í síðustu viku stóð innanríkisráðuneytið fyrir opnum fundi hvort setja eigi á laggirnar sjálfstæða mannréttindastofnun á Íslandi. Við höfum fengið hvatningu á grundvelli allra samninga sem Ísland aðili að hjá Sameinuðu þjóðunum til þess að koma á fót slíkri stofnun frá mannréttindafulltrúa Sameinuðu þjóðanna og mannréttindafulltrúa Evrópuráðsins. Eins og sérfræðingar fjölluðu á þeirri málstofu hefur áhersla á slíkar stofnanir fengið síaukið vægi í alþjóðlegri umræðu. Við erum nú að skoða þær áskoranir sem við stöndum frammi fyrir, staðráðin í því að verða við þeim og þannig að markmiðin sem stefnt náist. Þar að ýmsu að hyggja. Smátt samfélag kann að leita annarra lausna en stórt. Við þurfum að hyggja að samlegðaráhrifum og því hvernig fjármunir nýtist sem best. Í mínum huga stofnun sjálfstæðrar mannréttindastofnunar ekki spurning hvort heldur hvenær hún verður að veruleika, því eitt víst að við verðum og viljum axla skyldur okkar á grundvelli 33. greinar sáttmálans eftirlit. Á markvissan og ígrundaðan hátt þurfum við að komast að niðurstöðu. Að því nú stefnt. Erindi og umræður hér í dag verða mikilvægt innlegg í þá vinnu. Ég hlakka til að fylgjast með umræðunni, en þurfi ég að bregða mér frá það til að taka þátt í umræðu og atkvæðagreiðslu á Alþingi lagabreytingar réttindi í kjörkleifanum sem ég áður hef nefnt. Þar þarf fundarstjórinn hugsanlega einnig að verða afsakaður, en hann hefur aldrei látið sig vanta þegar á hefur þurft að halda í réttindabaráttu fatlaðs fólks. Ég óska okkur öllum til hamingju með þetta málþing. Það vitnisburður þann ásetning okkar að halda fram á við í réttindabaráttunni, ekki aðeins fyrir fatlað fólk heldur samfélagið í heild sinni. Vilji samfélag kalla sig mannréttindasamfélag, þá þarf það að sýna í orði og verki að svo sé í raun. Takk fyrir.
Já, við þakkum hæstvirtur ráðherra fyrir hans mál og fyrir þau skref sem hann hefur tekið í átt að þessu og eins fyrir þau sem hann hefur boðað að séu væntanleg. Ég bið nú velvirðingar á því að hafa hér í upphafi ekki talað í hljóðnemann. Það er stundum sagt haltur leiðir blindan. Ég stilti mér bara upp það sem Guðmundur hafði talað og hélt að maður ætti að gera það því að ég sá ekki ræðistöðing. En ég veit að þið sjáu augun á mér það. En við höfum hér næstan á mælendaskránni Stíg Langráð sem er formaður danska öryrkjabandalagsins. Stíg var í nefndinni sem að undirbjó innleiðingu samkomulags á vettvangi Sameinuðu þjóðanna og situr jafnframt í eftirlitsnefndinni með honum og ætlar hér að fjalla mikilvægi þátttöku samtaka fatlaðra í því að innleiða farsællega sáttmála Sameinuðu þjóðanna í hverju landi. Stíg Langráð, jag säger välkommen till Island och vi gläder oss till och tackar dig för att hålla ett tal här hos oss idag on the involvement of disabled people's organizations in implementing the UN's CRPD. Varsågod.
Thank you very much. Very interesting to be here. I'm not sure that I know what has been said so far, but I'm sure that the Minister promised you that he will ratify the UN CRPD as speedily as possible. Could you please change the slide? Yeah. My perspective today is to focus on the involvement of organizations of persons with disabilities because it is crucial to the successful implementation of the UN CRPD. I think that if you do not involve persons with disabilities, it will not be a success because the only one that really knows how it is to live with a disability on Iceland is those persons that have the disability themselves. We can guide the politicians, we can show the politicians, and we can convince the politicians. Next slide, please. I will be looking a little bit back on my own history, on my own involvement in the implementation, ratification of the UN CRPD. I will be going a little bit into how the Danish model is, some of the challenges I see. I will be going in and see what are we doing in the committee that are supposed to look into how governments behave. And I hope that at the end you will have some questions. I have to say that I'm talking on behalf of myself. I'm not talking on behalf of the committee. In the committee, we are 18 experts, and sometimes it is possible to say something on behalf of everyone, and sometimes you have to make your own interpretation to fit it into the society, into the country where you are talking. I have 40 years of experience in disability politics. I might not look that old, but I am that old.
And I have always thought that it is relevant for persons who do not know persons with disabilities and the realities that we are facing, that they meet persons with disabilities. And I have always realized the importance not to speak on behalf of yourself, but on behalf of persons with disabilities. I mean, every time we go out, it is important that we do not just talk about ourselves and our own experience, but that we talk about the experience from more than one. I mean, I can talk about accessibility, and then everyone would think that accessibility is the only question relevant when we're talking about persons with disabilities, and then I would forget the perspective of persons with autism, persons with visually impairment, deaf persons, hard of hearing, etc., etc. That is why we have DPOD, which is the equivalent to your umbrella organization, and we have been around for almost 80 years. And we have always been taking the perspective of the collective group of persons with disabilities. We were involved in the working group at the UN level, invited as members in the Danish delegation to the negotiations on should we have a convention or should we not have a convention. We had a working group in New York in 2001, and I was participating in that. And at that meeting, we discovered something that was very important. We discovered that persons with disabilities are capable of uniting, even on global level. We discovered that we were able to talk about solidarity. We were able to take the perspective of persons with psychosocial disabilities and persons with physical disabilities, persons with visual impairment, etc. I think that the collaboration between the different DPOs at global level made the difference. Because then the ambassadors that were supposed to negotiate, they had a hard time because they were always meeting the same demands, the same wishes, the same perspectives from everyone that they met when they came out of the room where they were negotiating. In Denmark, we have had some experience in changing the perspective. I mean, it was a challenge for us to change the perspective of our own organizations. They were used to think in one way, and now they should think in a new way. They were, what I would say, believers of the goodwill of the politicians, and now they had to change to use words like human rights, which was quite difficult at the beginning. It took 6 years to change the perspective of our own organizations. But when we decided to change, it was unanimously. It was almost boring to take that decision at our General Assembly. We have been involved in the ratification process in Denmark in the Parliament. We have been negotiating, dealing with the Ministry of Social Affairs, the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, on how to deal with this. What are the challenges? What will we be facing? What will happen? And of course, we always said to them that it was better to have a ratification of the UNCRPD and then take it from there, because then we would have the same language, then we would have the same guidelines, then we would have the same perspectives, and that is much easier when we are talking about changing the society to a more inclusive society for everyone. Instead of choosing the approach that they have chosen in Norway and Finland, where they say we have to make sure that all legislation is in place before we ratify. I mean, I cannot imagine that any country at any time will have all the legislation necessary, because when we have solved some problems, then there will be new problems. When we have solved some problems, there will be new developments that we have to take into consideration. So my recommendation to Iceland is actually to go ahead and take it from there. I have been involved together with some others in setting up the Danish model on how to monitor to secure the implementation of the UNCRPD, the so-called Article 33, which I will come back to. And I've been a member of the UNCRPD committee since 2010, and it is our obligation to look into countries, to have dialogue with countries on how are they, quote, behaving on disability, and then give them concluding observations, or rather recommendations for how to make things better. For instance, how to change the laws in Peru to secure that no person with disability are deprived of the right to vote because of his or her disability. I have dialogues with the Ombudsman in Denmark, who does play a significant role when it comes to disability. And I have dialogues with the Danish National Institute of Human Rights, which are responsible for the monitoring process according to Article 33(2) in the Convention. I think it was very difficult to change language from the charity medical model to the social human rights model. I remember once when I was in Brussels having a meeting with some representatives from my own government, from our civil servants, and then one of the ladies in the Ministry of Social Affairs came to me and said, I think that we will always be talking to each other in another language in the future. Because she was so used to do things good, to do something that was really close to her heart. But now it was not just about doing something good, it was about doing something because it was a right to be able to live included. We still talk, we are still good friends, and we do still collaborate, but it changed the way that we talked. And it also changed the path that we choose. I think this is a challenge for politicians, civil servants, lawyers, employers, employees, researchers, media, persons with disabilities, organizations with disabilities, and many others. It was only recently we had a very good debate in the Parliament on access, equal access to health services. And that was the first time where we really saw that the politicians was using the UNCRPD language. Yes. The Danish model. The Article 33 has 3 elements. Paragraph 1, 2, and 3. The first one is about how to implement. I mean, first you have to make sure that before you start implementing, you know where are we. Does that mean I have to finish? No?
You have plenty of time.
Yeah. But we need to know where we are, and we need to know where we will go. Otherwise it will be just like Alice in Wonderland. If we don't know where we want to go, it doesn't matter which way we take or which road we take. So, first of all, you have to make sure that you know how our legislation, and then you decide on how to implement it within each sector in society. And that is the responsibility of the Ministry of Social Affairs and Integration. They are what we in the UNCRPD language call the focal point, the coordinating mechanism for securing transformation of legislation in relation to transport, right to vote, access to inclusive education, etc. They must be what you in England would call the chief whip of the parliament. I think that the model that we have chosen is perhaps correct, but the obligations of the Ministry of Social Affairs are not very clear, and the focal points within each ministry is not very active and not very, how should you say, proactive. I think we can do better. I think we can strengthen this and do it to the benefit of not just us, but also to the benefit of themselves. If you look into Article 33, we have put the obligation of monitoring the development into the hands of the National Institute of Human Rights. That is something we have been doing on the guidance from the disability environment. And you have to realize one thing, and that is that the monitoring mechanism must be independent of government. It must live up to the so-called Paris principles, which are some principles about independence of human rights mechanisms. And in Denmark we have what you would call a class A+++ independent mechanism. And we found that it was natural to put the obligation into the hands of them, give them some resources. I think they got 6 million or something per year to make sure that they could perform this task. And we are, as DPOs, given a seat in the board of the Institute, so we have influence on the priorities within the Institute on human rights. So it lives up to involving persons with disabilities. But I think that the Institute have some difficulties because they are not dealing with complaints. I mean, if you want to file a complaint on the basis of any kind of discrimination, it is dealt with elsewhere. We do not have a united mechanism for dealing with complaints on discrimination of persons with disabilities. I would recommend that you choose another way here and unite all things so that you have expertise in this mechanism, and so that you are sure that you get your hands into the dirty work, because otherwise it can be a little bit academic. We have an Article 33.3, which is about involvement of civil society. We have changed our National Disability Council into a civil society organization where we have experts in the field of disability, education, technology, transport, together with persons representing organizations of persons with disabilities, dialogue, having a dialogue on the development in the society of Denmark. I think it is living up to the intentions, but again, it has turned out, from my personal perspective, to be a little bit too much expert-oriented. We don't really take the necessary steps, the necessary initiatives, probably because the obligation is not very clear. If we look into what are we doing in the committee, I mean, we are looking into countries. We have been looking at countries like Argentina, Spain, Hungary, China, Peru, and a few more. And we give them concrete recommendations on how to make changes in the legislation. And we are always focusing on Article 33, because it is so extremely important that you have a high quality, high-class quality in your implementation, in the follow-up on how to make sure that things are happening and things are going in the right direction. So we're always looking about how do you involve persons with disabilities? How do you involve persons with disabilities and their organizations? If you do not do that, like in Paraguay, I mean, they're not even aware of the fact that they have organizations of persons with disabilities. Then we will always say, please take note of this and make an environment where you support the establishment and involvement of organizations of persons with disabilities. And notice I'm always saying of persons with disabilities. We would never, never, ever recommend service providers to be speaking on behalf of persons with disabilities, unless the service providers are of organizations. We are always focusing on the independence. I mean, when we were dealing with Spain, and you will later be talking to Javier, and he's from Spain, we were very concerned on whether there was, if it was an independent mechanism that they had established in Spain. It is, according to the knowledge that we had, but we only got that knowledge actually during the debate with the representatives from Spain. So we are very concerned about independence and whether it is living up to the Paris principles. Think about China. We have just had a dialogue with China, and the Chinese Federation of Persons with Disabilities is what I would call semi-independent. They are part of the party. And if you are not a part of the party and a part of the federation, you are not taken into consideration. We often ask questions to the state parties on this issue. We talked to the representatives from China, it was 35 people. We did ask them, how are you securing independence of organizations of persons with disabilities? And when we are finalizing and giving recommendations, we always say, how can you take initiatives to secure involvement of DPOs, like in Tunisia? They could go in and perhaps fund the establishment of organizations of persons with disability, capacity building, but also changing the laws so that persons with disabilities are consulted. And how can you bring yourself in your monitoring mechanism closer to compliance with the Paris principles? So we are very concerned on this, and when Iceland, at the end of the day, when you have to have your dialogue with the committee, we will be focusing on this issue as well, because it is challenging and it is different, but it is a right to be involved, and involvement is not necessarily the same as deciding, because you can only decide if you are clever, because at the end of the day, it is the politicians that take the decision in the parliament. Please change. So this was what I was going to say. Feel free to ask any question that will pop up in your mind and that perhaps can assist you on your way. Thank you very much.
Hvernig kveikir á þessu hér?
Já, kveikir á.
Já,
Thank you. I wonder, how is the crisis? I know your government in Denmark is in reverse here about every service and trying to save money. How is this affecting you? And you said now that we should implement this UN treaty right away and then take on the laws. But you also said that we have to look at the laws we have to know where we are going. So your comment on that, please. Thank you.
Please.
I think that when we look upon the financial crisis, it's difficult because the financial crisis have created an environment where you want to cut in public expenditures, and that is happening all over. But even though that you have this financial crisis, I think it is possible to make some improvements. You have a lot of things that can be without any costs. I mean, I would recommend that my government changes its legislation so that no one can be deprived of the right to vote, because that is without any costs. But it will make a significant signal to persons with disabilities. And I think that I would have loved the crisis to be a little bit later, because it was unfortunate. It came right at the same time as we did ratify the UNCRPD. I think we would have been more ready today to utilize the UNCRPD to make sure that what was the consequences, the cuts, that we perhaps could have avoided some of the traditional cuts, and perhaps could have had some dialogue on how to make sure that the cuts were not affecting persons at the local community in the way that they are. I think we were simply not ready to use the UNCRPD at that time. And it is difficult because the UNCRPD is a dynamic tool. I mean, if it goes up, it must also go up for persons with disabilities, and if it goes down, we will always be in the hands of the majority. I mean, we are only 10 to 12% of the population. We are always depending on the majority, but I think we could have had less effect, less impact of the crisis if we had been where we are today. But I don't think that the UNCRPD is the tool to secure that the crisis does not affect persons with disabilities, but it could have been used to change things so that the consequences were not felt that way.
Thank you. Ladies speaker.
I'm an activist for all nations in Russia. This is not physical or mental disorders. I will ask you to speak for one question. Thank you very much for your how many people in Denmark have mental disorders, andlega sjúkdóma, getur þú hjálpað mér? Are you supporting them? Are you working together? Because in Iceland, people with mental disorders and physical are not working together, and that thing is most problem in Iceland. And do you have also a group who's working with salaries, number one? Er ekki hægt að laga þetta ekko sem á mikrofónunum? Er ekki tæknimaður hérna? Það svo mikið bergmál á mikrofónunum að það skipt svo illa hvað fólk segir í það. En það skilur svo að fixta ekko.
I'm not sure I understand the first part of your question. Can you speak right into the microphone?
My name is Hörpu. I am an activist. I work for all countries in Iceland. Does this come where? I was asking you, Steve, do you work with all, both mental disorder and physical disability in Denmark, or just specific for physical? Here in Iceland, we have 37% people who are pensionists with a card like this, who doesn't have money to eat or keep themselves. I had it done here in Iceland, the people doesn't work here. 37% with mental disability are out of union. That is the biggest problem, that people do not work together. How is it in your country, in Denmark, in England?
Yes. In Denmark, persons with psychosocial disabilities or mental disabilities or the so-called mad people, what we used to call them in the old days, they are a part of the organization. And we are actually using quite a lot of resources on those challenges that persons with psychosocial disabilities are facing, especially in relation to not being thrown out of employment, and if it happens, to make sure that they can return to employment. And we think that the most important thing for persons with psychosocial disabilities is actually the right to have financial means that can create, how should you say it, security in your life, because I think that it is the most important thing. If you have financial insecurity, you will not be able to deal with your daily activities, then that will be threatening to further develop your psychosocial disability in the wrong direction. That is one thing. The other thing is that when we are working in the committee under the UNCRPD, the question of legal capacity, the question on persons with psychosocial disabilities is actually taking at least 1/3 of our time, because it is so important that we change the mindset of politicians and civil servants to understand that even though you have a psychosocial disability, you have the right to participate, the right to decide, the right not to have forced interventions, etc., etc. So we are really focusing on improving the rights of persons with psychosocial disabilities, both in Denmark and especially in the committee. Speak into the microphone and say,
our point is for disability organizations to partner with the government to implement electrical means for people to turn in forms and any communication with the government.
I'm sure. Did you hear it?
I think. Can I ask you to come up to the picture so that everyone can hear it just loud and clearly? Og ég byrði að hérna bara upp í ræðustofun og nota hljóðina og það heyrist í niður.
Í kaffihléi þá viljum við kaffifólkið að skoða þetta verðmál sem hérna að gera fyrir að skilja svo kannan.
Gjörðu svo vel.
Thank you. Do they hear me now? How important is it for disability organizations to pressure the government to implement electrical means to turn in forms or any other communication with the government?
I think that we are living in a world where government politicians want to modernize the way they will communicate. And if we do not make sure that everyone can communicate input, that means if we do not have accessible communication in relation to persons with visually impairment, physical impairment, dyslexia, etc., then we will not be able to take the benefit of the modernization of the society if you have a disability. So I think it is extremely important that we, as representatives of persons with disabilities, are in dialogue with our civil servants and politicians on how to make sure that we have an inclusive society of communication in the future. And it is also to the benefit of the politicians, because every time I can do something myself, then the Ministry for Social Affairs can cut down in his or her budget. So it is a win-win situation. It is easy for the government to secure the, what I would call the infrastructure of communication, and then letting people with disabilities act on behalf of themselves, instead of providing assistance when it is only needed because of inaccessibility to communication. That is something that we are really discussing in Denmark every day, and I think it is necessary for governments to decide on mandatory standards for communication, securing access regardless of disability and regardless of age.
Thank you.
Við erum með spurningu hér ekki. Vil du koma á þessu línu?
Guðmundur Ingi Fisson heit ég, formaður bótar samfélag. I want to ask you about if it's very good to have this right for people like me. People in Iceland today, some of those rights is about don't have house or food. That's fighting. If this law will be and the government will break that, how can we get our rights to the courts? Because we don't have money. We can ask the government about money to go to the court, but they have 3 lawyers in there. Then they have programmers to say no money. You can't go to court. So I ask, how is it out to Denmark and everywhere? Do you have money? Can you go to court? Thank you.
I think that access to justice is an incredibly important issue. At the moment, I think it's difficult to make sure that persons with disabilities can go and bring their cases to the court because of lack of financial resources, at least in many countries. But in the Nordic countries, I think we have so much wealth that it is possible for us to create independent mechanisms, complaint mechanisms, where you can go if you want to file a complaint. If you look to Great Britain, to England, they have equal, and I think it's called the Equality Rights Commission. They have approximately 85 people employed just to deal with complaints from citizens on this and that in relation to rights. If we go in, we have mechanisms to deal with complaints in relation to some of the parts that have been, some of the regulations coming from the European Union. But when it comes to the question on daily living, the income that we pay, our milk, our rent, our transport, then it is more difficult. But I still think that if you look into the convention, Article 28, it does say that you should have an adequate standard of living through an income. And if you look onto Article 27, it does say that you should be employed on the open labor market if you have a disability. So I think that you have various possibilities to put pressure on the decision makers, but at the end of the day, it is dynamic, and we do not really know whether we can use tools like this to change the policies. But we can make sure that everyone understands the need of everyone to have a basic income to secure their daily life, but we cannot be sure that it is coming through income or if it is coming through subsidiaries to rent or whatever. But it is extremely important, especially today, and especially if we look outside the Nordic countries, where you are seeing people with disabilities being extremely poor, extremely marginalized, extremely unemployed. So I think that, from my personal perspective, I think in the Nordic countries, we should be able to deal with that problem within our financial resources. But access to justice is difficult because you have to pay the law.
Thank you. Fleiri spurningar? Well, it's an interesting point on access to justice, I remember almost 20 years ago, I worked with your predecessor, Sven Jensen, who claimed that if the individual member of the handicapped organizations would have to go to court, then the organization had failed. But you worked on changing.
He said many things.
Yeah, changing the approach. But you mentioned complaint mechanisms, and we will be implementing the EU directives against discrimination from 2000 this winter, and there has been some discussion on complaint mechanisms, whether you should have special complaint mechanisms for people with disabilities, or whether we should use existing mechanisms, as we have had concerning laws that ban discrimination of women, or whether minority group as in general should have the same complaint mechanisms. Do you have a view on that?
We have had the same discussion in Denmark since Sven Jensen. I think that it is important to understand that disability is a science in itself. We are a very heterogeneous group, and I think it is not a very good idea to have complaint mechanisms that are dealing with gender, labor, trade unions, transport, etc., etc., etc. I would recommend that we have a much more unified approach to persons with disabilities in relation to the European regulations, in relation to the UNCRPD, because then you have the expertise in discovering disability. If you do not have it as a top priority, you might forget the perspective of disability, and then you will treat persons with disabilities like everyone else, not giving them the special protection in relation to, for instance, employment that they are entitled to. And I think that the number of persons with disabilities are very few, and the number of complaints based on disability are very few. So to make sure that you have the expertise, I would recommend to have one board instead of having one in the sector of sea transport, air transport, bus transport, railroad transport, employment, etc. That is not very efficient.
Yes, thank you. Flere spurningar?
Thank you, Steve, for your interesting overview. I have actually two questions I would like to ask you to reflect on. First of all, with regard to the influence and the importance of disabled people's organizations and disabled people to influence the implementation and monitoring of the convention. Can you tell us a little about what kind of mechanisms are being used in different countries to ensure this access to have influence, for example, within municipalities, within human rights institutions? You mentioned that you have a seat on the board of the Danish Human Rights Institution, and you know, in terms of governments, ministries, and policy making. Sort of what can you give us a couple of maybe good examples of how people have done that that we can look to when we try to figure out what is a good way of involving disabled people and make sure that DPOs have good have significant influence?
I think that it's important to understand that even though that organizations of persons with disabilities can be a pain in the ass to politicians, that they are very important, and that we need to support them financially to make their job, and even perhaps to use budget lines to make sure that the disability movement can be the coordinating civil society organization on drawing up the so-called shadow reports or alternative reports on how things are improving. I mean, governments are always painting the good perspective. The independent mechanism is always painting the so-called right perspective, and the disability organization will always be able to paint the perspective from persons with disabilities, which does not necessarily reflect, but which is important to make sure that we have all the input necessary. So supporting the disability movement in playing a key role for the implementation of the UN CRPD is important. Secondly, I think it is important to involve with the DPOs in the action plan that is necessary, because no country is actually at a situation where they are living up to the UN CRPD, and no one will ever be. But involving persons with disabilities in the drawing up of an action plan from the beginning to the end, make sure that the priorities are discussed, and make sure that the solutions that are chosen are reflecting the needs of persons and the needs and experience of persons with disabilities. I think it is also relevant to have a dialogue with organizations of persons with disabilities on regular basis, with the focal point in the government, the coordinating mechanism, those that are in charge of securing the implementation of the UN CRPD. And I think it is essential that you find a way to have direct contact, direct dialogue between disability organizations and the monitoring mechanism. And that is what I would say on the national level. But on the local level, I think, in Denmark and on Iceland, it is the municipalities that are implementing the legislation. They are not deciding the legislation, but they are implementing. And I think it is also relevant to have mechanisms that are guaranteeing that persons with disabilities are in dialogue with civil servants and politicians at municipality level, because you can, at local level, you can decide what kind of school do we want, what schools should be accessible before others, if they are not accessible. You can use the dialogue to make sure that you take the right decisions at local municipality level, how to make sure that you have a place where persons with psychosocial disabilities can go and meet each other, etc., etc. And the output of this dialogue is actually that instead of having two groups fighting each other, then you will have two groups going in the same direction, because we have agreed that this is the path that we will follow.
Thank you. Flere spurningar?
I just would say I agree that we should work together. It's better. Thank you very much.
Takk fyrir það. Fleiri spurningar? Að gera nota tækifærið þegar við höfum verið með reynslu fjölmörgum löndum af innleiðingunni, en I think I will finally seize the opportunity again. I was, you mentioned local authorities, I was asked to put forward a question concerning how we handle job market issues here in the country. They are currently being handled by the municipalities when it concerns people with disabilities, but job market issues in general are on the national level. So it's being debated whether this is in accordance with the approach in the UN CRPD, and if you would have a comment on that. And then another thing from the debate here in the country, as you would be aware of, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Children was in Norway a few years ago made a part of the national legislation, so that the convention was put forward as a bill in the parliament and agreed as a part of the national legislation from word to word, instead of changing diverse, all kinds of local laws and then ratifying. The organization of the handicapped here in the country has called for the same thing concerning the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, that it in its entirety becomes simply a part of the Icelandic legislation rather than being ratified. We have one such convention, the European Convention on Human Rights, that is simply Icelandic legislation, but all other conventions on human rights, they have been ratified. And if you would have a view on which approach would be better.
I'll start with focusing on employment. The UNCRPD does not say anything about how the state should organize its efforts to improve access to labor market. But it does say that persons with disabilities are supposed to be employed, and to be employed on the open labor market. So it is not necessary through sheltered employment or whatever. From a personal perspective, I think it is interesting to have the obligation for persons with disabilities together with the obligations for unemployment for other persons. Because if we do not do that, then we will forget persons with disabilities, and then we will only take the fruits that are hanging very low on the trees and not dealing with disability, then we will forget persons with disabilities. So we have to find a way to make sure that they are, or we are, in the same, under the same responsibility. If we talk about how to implement or incorporate the UNCRPD in national legislation, I think you can choose 3 ways. There are countries where, when they have ratified an international convention, then it becomes a part of legislation automatically, like England. Or you can choose to have a legislation saying that it is not right to discriminate on the grounds of disability, and to put an obligation on every sector to make action plans and make, how should you say, and be accountable to the Parliament on the development within each sector. Or you can use the way to implement or incorporate the disability perspective in all legislations, or you can choose a mix of that. But I would say in the Nordic countries, at least a legislation saying that it is not allowed to discriminate on the grounds of disability in public or private sector, I think that would be necessary at least, but also to implement or incorporate. I mean, if this is about the right to vote, I mean, you cannot just have a legislation saying that you cannot discriminate, but you have to change the laws for election to make sure that no one can be deprived of the right to vote, even though they are in a so-called psychiatric institution or whatever.
Yes, well, thank you both for your speech and for your answers to the questions raised. I think we will then take a coffee break for 30 minutes. Haldið kaffihléi. Thank you.